The world of magic doesn't end with the turning of a page. Love rises and falls anew, forbidden like poison or blazing like a phoenix's flame. The heroes we thought we knew uncover their hearts once more. So step into the enchantment of emotion and welcome to a world where love is written anew. The burrow stood proudly as ever, leaning slightly to one side as though bowing to the years of laughter that had echoed through its crooked halls. The garden hummed with life, gnomes scurrying beneath pumpkin vines, chickens clucking lazily near the back door, and the faint smell of Molly Weasley's stew drifting through the crisp spring air. Yet, inside, a quiet lingered that had nothing to do with the weather. George Weasley sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. His eyes, once so alive with mischief, stared blankly at the knot in the wooden surface before him. He didn't hear the faint popping sound outside, the telltale sign of someone apparating nearby, until the kitchen door swung open and a gust of cool air rushed in. "Blimey, it's good to be home," came a familiar voice, deep and cheerful. George looked up, blinking in disbelief. Charlie Weasley, tanned from years of Romanian sun and carrying the scent of smoke and dragon hide, stood in the doorway with a grin that could rival the sunrise. "Charlie." George rose slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching into something almost like a smile. "What in Merlin's name are you doing here?" "Thought I'd surprise you lot," Charlie said, setting down a worn leather bag. "Dragons are fine. The handlers, not so much. Broken arm last week, so they're making me take some leave. Figured I'd check if the old place still stands." He glanced around with affection. "Looks the same. Smells the same. Feels good." George chuckled softly, a sound that surprised him. "Still the same chaos, yeah. Mum's going to faint when she sees you." "Oh, she already did," Charlie said with a grin. "Hugged me until my ribs cracked. Dad nearly joined in just to finish the job." For a moment, the two brothers just looked at each other, one full of restless energy, the other weighed down by unspoken grief. The air between them felt both familiar and fragile. Later, as they sat outside on the worn garden bench, the sunset painting the sky with streaks of gold and violet, Charlie glanced sideways at his younger brother. "You've done well, you know. The shop, I mean." George gave a small shrug. "Yeah, Fred and I built it to last." His voice faltered at his brother's name, and the silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Charlie didn't push. He knew that silence, had lived it after friends had died in dragon fires and left holes words couldn't fill. Instead, he clapped George gently on the shoulder. "I saw the storefront last week when I got in. Bright as ever. It's good you kept it going." George nodded, swallowing hard. "It helps. Some days." They sat there until the stars began to peek through the twilight. Charlie spoke of dragons, of the strange landscapes of Romania, of nights so cold your eyebrows froze. George listened, quietly thankful for the distraction. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than emptiness. The next morning at the burrow was its usual whirl of movement and noise. Molly's wand flicked furiously as pots stirred themselves, while Arthur buried his nose in a muggle wiring manual at the table. Ron and Hermione had stopped by with their little girl, and Ginny popped in after Quidditch practice, hair still wind-tossed. Laughter filled the kitchen, the kind George had missed. That was when she arrived. A gentle knock sounded on the doorframe, and a young woman peeked inside, her dark hair tied neatly, her blue eyes warm and alert. "Mrs. Weasley, sorry to drop in unannounced. Percy sent me. I'm Audrey Spinett from the Department of Magical Transportation." Molly turned, beaming. "Oh, of course, dear. Percy mentioned you. Come in, come in. You must be famished." Audrey laughed softly, her cheeks dimpling. "I wouldn't say no to tea." As she stepped into the kitchen, George's gaze caught hers for a fleeting moment. There was something quietly magnetic about her, not dazzling or dramatic, but steady, like the calm after a storm. She seemed to notice him too, offering a polite nod before joining Percy by the table. Charlie, on the other hand, noticed everything. From the way Audrey tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear to the way she spoke, measured yet kind. He found himself smiling without realizing it. George didn't think much of it then. He was used to people coming and going, new faces at the Burrow. But something about Audrey lingered at the edge of his mind long after she left that afternoon. Maybe it was her voice, or the way she'd looked at him, not with pity, but curiosity. That night, as the house settled into quiet once more, George sat by the window of his old room. Below, he could hear Charlie laughing with Ginny and Ron outside, their voices carrying on the breeze. He should have joined them, but instead, he stayed there, staring at the stars. He thought of Fred, as he always did before bed. But this time, another face slipped into his thoughts. A woman's face, framed by dark hair and bright blue eyes. He frowned at himself, half annoyed, half intrigued. Meanwhile, outside, Charlie lay on the grass, hands behind his head, looking at the same stars. His thoughts too wandered back to Audrey Spinett, her laughter, the spark in her eyes when she teased Percy about his paperwork. Two brothers, one unexpected connection, and neither yet realized that the course of their hearts had just quietly shifted under the same sky that had watched over every Weasley before them. And above the Burrow the stars gleamed, as though they knew what even fate had only just begun to weave. The following week passed in the kind of lively rhythm that only the Burrow could sustain. The hum of daily magic, the laughter of family, the smell of something perpetually baking. Charlie settled in easily, helping his father mend shed wiring and patch up the henhouse with spells that were far too powerful for the job. Molly watched him with teary eyes, grateful to have another of her boys home, even if only for a little while. George, meanwhile, threw himself into the shop with quiet determination. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes had always been a monument to laughter, but now it had become his sanctuary, a place where invention and memory collided. Diagon Alley pulsed with life again after the war, and the shop was busier than ever. Customers poured in, eager for new pranks and novelties, unaware of the bittersweet ache behind George's polite smiles. Charlie accompanied him sometimes, helping to stock shelves or test products, often with disastrous results. "You're supposed to shake it once, not like you're attacking it," George barked one afternoon, laughing as purple smoke exploded across the room, leaving Charlie's hair a brilliant shade of violet. "Consider it field testing," Charlie retorted through his laughter. Dragons never complained this much. For a moment, everything felt simple. The two of them shoulder to shoulder, the air ringing with laughter that echoed faintly of the past. But as days passed, George began noticing how often Audrey appeared. usually with a stack of ministry papers for Percy, sometimes with a message for Molly, or a cup of tea offered in quiet politeness. She was friendly, professional, and always seemed slightly amused by the chaos surrounding the Weasleys. Yet there was a gentleness to her that drew people in, a calm in her presence that even George couldn't ignore. It was one such afternoon when Audrey stayed for lunch. Percy had invited her to discuss an upcoming inspection at the Flu Network Authority. But by the time they reached the burrow, Molly had already decided they were staying for a meal. The table was crowded, voices overlapping in the familiar din of conversation. George found himself watching Audrey across the table, her laughter clear and soft, her eyes lighting up as Ginny told a story about a botched Quidditch practice. When Molly insisted everyone try her treacle tart, Audrey leaned forward to help pass the plates, her sleeve brushing George's hand. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a ripple through him, an unfamiliar warmth, small but undeniable. He looked away quickly, forcing a smile when Ron teased him about being quiet. But the truth was simple. For the first time in years, someone had made him feel something other than hollow. That evening, George walked her to the gate. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with pink and gold. "Thanks for the help today," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Audrey smiled. "I should be thanking you. Your mother insists I'm too thin and keeps trying to feed me half the pantry." "That's Mum for you." George chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. If she had her way, she'd open a restaurant just so she could mother everyone in Britain. "She's wonderful," Audrey said softly. "You all are." George hesitated, studying her face. There was no pity there, no trace of that delicate sympathy people often gave him when they remembered Fred. She simply looked at him, waiting, present. It was grounding in a way he hadn't expected. "I'll walk you to the lane," he offered. They strolled through the garden, the night humming with a faint sound of crickets. At the end of the path, she turned to him. "I'll see you soon, George." He nodded, smiling faintly. "Yeah, see you soon." When she disapparated with a soft pop, the air felt oddly still. George stood for a while longer, staring at the spot she'd vanished from, until the chill of the evening pushed him back inside. Charlie was in the kitchen, cleaning a burn mark from his arm, the result of another experimental firework gone wrong. "You're late," he said, without looking up. "Walk Audrey home?" George paused at the threshold. "Just to the lane. Percy's colleague, you know." Charlie smirked faintly. "A colleague, sure. Pretty one, though." George rolled his eyes. "You noticed?" "Hard not to," Charlie said, drying his hands. "Bright eyes, that one. Reminds me of a dragon I once knew. Quiet until you get close, then fire everywhere." George chuckled, shaking his head. "Merlin help her if you start comparing her to dragons." Charlie grinned. "Just saying. She's interesting." Something in his tone made George glance up, but Charlie's expression was unreadable. The moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced by laughter and talk of the next day's plans. Still, a faint unease lingered beneath George's ribs. Not jealousy, not yet, but a subtle awareness that something had shifted again. Over the next several weeks, Audrey became a familiar figure at the burrow. She often arrived in the evenings, sometimes to help Percy, sometimes to share tea with Molly, and sometimes simply to sit in the garden with Ginny, talking about everything and nothing. George found himself seeking her out, bringing her new joke products to test, listening when she spoke about her work at the ministry, even walking her to the gate when she left. Her laughter made the house feel warmer, and her kindness seemed to reach parts of him he'd thought long gone. Yet Charlie was there too, always nearby, always effortlessly charming. He'd make her laugh with wild stories from Romania or offer to help her carry stacks of parchment from the kitchen. Where George's humour was dry and quiet, Charlie's was bold and easy, and Audrey seemed to enjoy both. One evening, the three of them sat by the fire, a pot of tea between them. Outside, rain whispered against the windows. Charlie was telling a story about a young dragon that had mistaken a handler's hat for an egg. Audrey was laughing so hard she nearly spilled her tea. George watched them both, the glow of the fire softening their faces. For a brief moment, he saw it. The way Charlie looked at her, the spark in his eyes when she laughed. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. George turned away, focusing on the flames. The fire popped, and he felt the echo of something old and painful stirring in his chest. A memory of sharing everything with Fred, of never competing, of knowing they were always two halves of one whole. But now, here he was, standing across a divide he didn't know how to cross. When the evening ended and Audrey said her goodbyes, Charlie offered to walk her out. George stayed by the hearth, staring into the embers. He could hear their voices fading into the rain, light, easy, comfortable. For the first time since Fred's death, George felt truly uncertain. Not about grief, but about his own heart. Outside, thunder rumbled softly in the distance. And inside the burrow, two brothers began, unknowingly, to drift toward the same storm. The next morning dawned with a thin mist curling around the hills of Otteries and Catchpole. The burrow looked like something out of a dream, smoke curling from its chimney, chickens pecking lazily at the damp earth, and the faint smell of Molly's breakfast drifting through the open windows. Inside, the family gathered around the kitchen table in their usual disarray, chatter and clinking spoons filling the air. George sat between Ginny and Charlie, absently stirring his tea. Across the table, Percy was discussing ministry paperwork, while Audrey, seated beside him, took notes with patient precision. Her quills scratched softly against parchment, her calm focus oddly grounding amid the chaos. When breakfast ended, Percy hurried off to the study, muttering about deadlines, and the others began to disperse. But Audrey lingered by the table, chatting with Molly about a charity project for war orphans. George found himself listening, though he pretended to be looking for something in a drawer. Charlie noticed, of course. He always did. With a teasing grin, he nudged George's arm. "You've been polishing that spoon for 5 minutes, mate. Planning to see your reflection or summon a genie." George scowled, shoving the spoon back into the drawer. "I'm thinking, that's all." "About her?" Charlie's grin widened. George turned sharply. "What?" Charlie leaned against the counter, arms folded, eyes bright with mischief. "Audrey, you like her?" "Don't be daft," George said, a bit too quickly. "She's Percy's colleague." Charlie raised a brow. "Right, and I'm a house elf. You're not subtle, George. You smile when she's around." George frowned, though a small part of him knew it was true. "And what about you?" he said, deflecting. "You've been glued to her side every evening." Charlie shrugged. "She's easy to talk to. Reminds me there's more to life than dragon burns and campfire meals. Their eyes met, light against shadow, ease against unease. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed to hum, as though the old walls of the burrow sensed the quiet tension forming. Then Molly's voice cut through from the other room. "Charlie, dear, fetch me that basket from the garden, won't you? The one by the pumpkins." Charlie grinned and clapped George on the shoulder. "Later, little brother. We'll finish this conversation when you've stopped pretending." George watched him go, a twist forming in his chest that had nothing to do with jealousy. Not yet, but something heavier, harder to name. That afternoon, the rain returned, soft at first, then steady. Audrey came again, carrying a small stack of files from the ministry. She looked slightly flushed from the damp strands of hair sticking to her forehead. George was at the table repairing a skiving snack box charm when she entered, and for a moment neither said a word. "Busy day?" she asked finally, setting the files down. "You could say that." He gestured at the mess of boxes and parchment. "Trying to invent something Fred would have called brilliant, and Mum would have banned." She smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." They talked a while, the conversation light and easy. Audrey asked about the shop, about how he managed it alone. George found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone, about the silence that fell after Fred's laughter was gone, about how hard it had been to find humor again. "I'm sorry," Audrey said softly, her voice full of sincerity, not pity. "You've kept his spirit alive in that shop. That takes courage." George looked at her, startled. No one had ever said it quite like that before. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to stop." She laughed, the sound gentle and bright. "Stubbornness and courage aren't that different." Just then, the door opened and Charlie entered, rain dripping from his cloak. "I could use a drying charm," he said cheerfully, shaking water everywhere. Audrey flicked her wand with a laugh, drying his hair in a puff of steam. "Show off," George muttered, though his lips twitched into a smile. Charlie dropped into the seat beside them, stretching his legs out lazily. "You two look serious. Did I interrupt something?" "Not at all," Audrey said. "We were just talking about the shop." "Ah, the shop." Charlie leaned back. "You should see George in action, Audrey. He once turned my hair green for a week." "Only because you tried to sell fake wands to actual customers," George shot back. "Details," Charlie said, grinning. Audrey laughed again, and George caught the flicker of light in her eyes when she looked at Charlie. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The air grew heavier, the warmth of moments before cooling into something uncertain. By evening, the rain had stopped and a soft fog had rolled in. Audrey stayed for dinner, and afterward, everyone gathered in the sitting room. Ginny played a slow tune on a charmed harp, and Molly knitted by the fire. Charlie sat by the window, talking quietly with Audrey, his voice low and easy. George watched them from across the room, pretending to tinker with a prototype, but his hands barely moved. He knew Charlie wasn't doing anything wrong. He never did. Charlie was all warmth and openness, his laughter like sunlight. But it stung nonetheless, seeing Audrey's smile tilt just a bit wider when Charlie spoke. Later, after she had gone, George stepped outside into the cool night. The mist clung to the grass, silver under the moonlight. He breathed in deeply, trying to quiet his thoughts. The door creaked open behind him. Can't sleep either. Charlie's voice drifted softly through the fog. Something like that, George murmured. Charlie came to stand beside him, silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "She's remarkable, isn't she?" George didn't answer. The silence stretched. Finally, he said, "Yeah, she is." "I don't know what it is," Charlie went on. "She just fits here, like she's always been part of it." George swallowed hard. Maybe she has. The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Then Charlie sighed, clapped him lightly on the back, and turned toward the door. "Don't stay out too long, brother. Mum'll have our heads if we catch cold." When George was alone again, he looked toward the darkened lane where Audrey had walked hours earlier. Something inside him tightened, a feeling both familiar and new, a strange ache that felt like both hope and dread. For the first time since Fred's death, his heart was alive, painfully, wildly alive. But as he watched the fog drift through the fields, he couldn't shake the quiet fear that he was about to lose something else entirely. And in the still night air, the burrow stood watching, its crooked chimneys and tilted walls seeming to lean closer, as if the old house itself sensed what was coming. A storm, not of thunder and rain, but of hearts caught in the crossfire of love and brotherhood. The next few weeks drifted by like leaves caught in a slow-moving current. The burrow thrummed with its usual mix of noise and warmth. Molly bustling about with endless recipes and errands, Arthur tinkering with enchanted muggle plugs, and Ginny's laughter echoing through the halls when she and Harry visited. Yet beneath that familiar rhythm, a quiet undercurrent had begun to stir. Something unseen but deeply felt. Audrey had become a part of the household in the most natural way. It seemed there was always a reason for her to stop by. A document Percy had forgotten, a recipe she wanted to copy from Molly, or a question about how the flu network reacted to thunderstorms. And every visit, no matter how brief, left a faint trace of brightness behind. To George, that brightness had become addictive. He found himself waiting for the soft knock on the door, the flutter of her voice down the hall, the way her laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight. When she wasn't there, he felt the silence more keenly than ever. But Charlie noticed too. She had come to watch the Quidditch match one Sunday afternoon. Ginny versus Ron, both arguing loudly about fouls and tactics before they'd even taken off. The burrow's backyard had been charmed into a makeshift pitch, complete with hovering hoops and cheering gnomes. Audrey stood near the garden fence, her scarf whipping in the breeze, her smile bright as the afternoon sky. George was supposed to be referee, though he'd barely paid attention to the game. He found his gaze drawn to her instead, to the way she clapped when Ginny scored, to how her eyes shone when Charlie swooped low on his broom to catch a rogue quaffle. Charlie, as it happened, noticed her watching too. He grinned mid-flight, showing off with a loop so tight even Ginny cheered. When he landed, mud splattered across his boots, and Audrey laughed, clapping her hands in delight. George's stomach tightened. After the game, while everyone crowded inside for cocoa and biscuits, George stayed outside under the shade of her apple tree, pretending to repair a broken broomstick charm. He heard the door open behind him and knew the footsteps at once. Audrey. "You disappeared," she said softly. "Just giving my ears a rest," George replied without looking up. "Those Weasley victory songs could raise the dead." She laughed, stepping closer. "You're not wrong. Ginny nearly deafened me." He risked a glance at her. There was a smudge of mud on her cheek, a small streak she hadn't noticed. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing it away with his thumb. She froze, not in alarm, but in that quiet stillness that happens when the world seems to pause between one breath and the next. "Thanks," she whispered. He drew his hand back quickly. "Sorry, didn't mean—" "It's all right." She smiled faintly. "You're always so careful, George. You don't have to be." Before he could respond, Charlie's voice cut through the air. "Oi, George, you hiding out again? Audrey, Mum's calling you. Says she won't let you leave without a slice of treacle tart." Audrey turned, her smile widening. "In that case, I'd better not keep her waiting." As she walked toward the house, Charlie fell into step beside her, his arm brushing hers in a way that seemed entirely natural. George watched them go, a hollow ache spreading through his chest like cold water. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint sounds of the house settling around him. In his mind, he kept replaying that moment beneath the apple tree. Her voice, her touch, the warmth that had sparked so suddenly and vanished just as quickly. By morning, he was more restless than ever. The shop in Diagon Alley needed restocking, and he decided to go early, if only to clear his thoughts. Charlie offered to help, as he often did, and though George would have preferred to work alone, he didn't say no. The streets were quiet that morning, the sky still heavy with the scent of rain. Inside the shop, the familiar scent of fireworks and sugar soothed George's nerves. For hours they worked in near silence until Charlie finally spoke. "You're quiet today," he said, balancing a box of trick ones on one arm. "Just tired." Charlie set the box down, then leaned against the counter. "You ever think about what you want next, George?" George frowned. "Next? Yeah, after all this. The shop's doing great. You've rebuilt what you lost, at least most of it. But what about you? Don't you ever wonder what comes after?" George hesitated. "I don't know. Haven't thought that far ahead." Charlie smiled faintly. "I have. About settling down one day. Maybe even finding someone who doesn't mind that I smell like dragon smoke half the time." There was an ease in his tone, but something in the way he said it made George's chest tighten again. He forced a small laugh. "Good luck with that. You'll have to find a woman with no sense of smell." Charlie grinned. "Maybe I already have." The words hung between them, light but heavy with meaning. George turned sharply, pretending to check an inventory list. "You mean Audrey?" Charlie didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "She's special. You can tell, can't you?" George nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can." They didn't speak for a long time after that. That evening, when they returned to the burrow, the scent of Molly's cooking filled the air. Audrey was there again, laughing with Arthur over some new ministry gadget. When Charlie entered, she smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes, soft and genuine. George felt something inside him give way. Dinner passed in a blur. He heard laughter, conversation, the scrape of forks and clinking glasses, but it all sounded distant, muffled. Afterward, when everyone gathered around the fireplace, he excused himself and slipped out into the garden. The night was cold, the sky clear and endless. He sat beneath the same apple tree where she'd stood earlier that day, and for the first time in years, he let himself feel everything. The ache of loss, the sting of jealousy, the fear of being left behind. He thought of Fred then, of how they'd shared everything, from jokes to dreams. What would Fred have said if he were here now? Probably something reckless, something brave. George tilted his head toward the stars and whispered, "I don't know what to do, mate." The wind rustled the leaves in answer, soft and low, as though the world itself was listening. And in that quiet moment, George made a decision. He would not stand aside, not this time. He'd lost enough already. He would tell her how he felt, no matter what it cost him. Inside the house, laughter continued, warm and oblivious. But outside, beneath the moonlit trees, a different story had begun. One that would test the strength of brotherhood, the boundaries of love, and the fragile courage of a man who had already lost half of himself. The morning came grey and chill, a pale mist drifting across the garden as dawn crept over the hills. The burrow was still asleep, its chimneys smoking faintly, its windows reflecting the first hints of sunlight. George stood at his window, pulling on his jumper, his mind already racing ahead. Today, he told himself, he would speak to her. He would find the right words, calm, steady words, and at last stop living in the half-light of what-ifs. Downstairs, the house slowly came alive. Molly's voice echoed faintly from the kitchen, Arthur humming as he read the prophet, the kettle whistling its usual impatient tune. George moved quietly, half hoping to escape before anyone noticed him. But as he reached for the door, Charlie appeared on the stairs, barefoot, hair ruffled, looking as though he'd just rolled out of bed. "Heading off early again?" Charlie asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Yeah," George said, keeping his tone light. "Got some orders to fill. Thought I'd get a head start." Charlie yawned. "Need a hand?" "No," George said quickly, too quickly. "Just routine work. You get some rest." Charlie shrugged, unconvinced but too tired to argue. "Suit yourself." George disapparated before the conversation could go further. When he arrived in Diagon Alley, the cobblestones were still wet from the night's rain. The shop stood waiting, shutters closed, the scent of fireworks and sugar still clinging to the air. Inside, the silence felt heavy. George worked through the motions, checking inventory, testing charms, but his thoughts wandered constantly to her. He replayed their last conversation under the apple tree again and again, searching for signs, for meaning, for hope. Maybe she had felt something too, that brief spark when he'd touched her cheek, the way her voice softened when she spoke his name. He had to believe it meant something. By noon, the decision was made. He would stop by the burrow that evening. Percy had mentioned Audrey was due to return with more papers for Arthur's research on enchanted household wiring. It would be his chance. The hours passed slowly. Even Fred's portrait on the shop wall seemed to watch him knowingly, a mischievous glint in the painted eyes. "Don't muck it up," George muttered to himself, feeling faintly ridiculous. When he returned to the burrow, the sky was beginning to darken. He could hear laughter even from the garden. Bright, easy laughter, the kind that made his stomach twist. He stepped through the back door and froze. Audrey was there, sitting by the hearth with Charlie. They were sharing cocoa, their heads bent close together as Charlie told some story that made her laugh until she had to wipe tears from her eyes. The sound hit George like a physical blow. He stood unnoticed for a long moment, watching the two of them. Charlie's hand brushed hers as he passed her a biscuit, and she didn't pull away. It was such a small thing, a simple, innocent touch, but it felt like a wall closing around him. Molly appeared beside him, smiling. "Oh, George, you're back early. Isn't it lovely? Charlie's finally found someone he seems to like." George's mouth went dry. What? Molly, oblivious to his struggle, sighed happily. "It's about time, isn't it? That boy's been alone too long. Audrey's a good one. Sensible, kind, just what he needs." George swallowed hard. "Yeah, just what he needs." He forced a smile, but his heart had turned to lead. Without another word, he slipped away upstairs, closing his door behind him. For the first time since the war, the walls of his old room felt suffocating. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the old photos on the dresser. Fred grinning with his arms slung around him, the two of them in front of the shop, sparks exploding above their heads. "You'd be laughing your head off right now, wouldn't you?" he whispered. "I can almost hear you saying it. You've gone and fallen for the same girl as Charlie, you great prat." His voice broke on the last word. Outside, laughter still floated up from below, and something inside him cracked. He wanted to hate Charlie, wanted to feel anger sharp enough to burn away the pain. But he couldn't. It was Charlie, the brother who'd always been there, who'd kept the family whole when Fred died, who had stayed long after he should have gone back to his dragons. George pressed his palms to his face. "I can't do this," he muttered. But he had to, because hiding from it would be worse. It would hollow him out until nothing remained but silence. He went downstairs again, just as Audrey was preparing to leave. She smiled when she saw him, though something in her expression faltered when she noticed his tension. "Long day?" she asked gently. "Something like that," George said, managing a small grin. "Walk you to the gate?" She hesitated, glancing back at Charlie, who was cleaning the table with a flick of his wand. Then she nodded. "All right." They stepped into the cool evening. The sun had long since sunk behind the hills, and the air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke. They walked in silence at first, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel beneath their shoes. Finally, Audrey spoke. "You're quiet tonight." George let out a breath that trembled faintly. "There's something I wanted to say." She stopped, turning to face him. The moonlight caught in her eyes, making them shine like blue glass. "I don't know how to say it properly," he continued, "but I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. You've brought something back into my life I thought was gone for good, and if I don't tell you, I'll regret it forever." Audrey's lips parted, but no sound came out. The breeze lifted her hair, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. "George," she said at last, her voice soft and pained, "you mean a lot to me, more than you probably realize. But—" he closed his eyes, already knowing. "But Charlie," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between them was thick with everything they couldn't say. Affection, confusion, guilt. After a moment, George nodded. "That's all right. You don't owe me anything. I just needed you to know." Audrey's eyes shimmered. "You're one of the kindest men I've ever met, George. Don't lose that, no matter what happens." He smiled faintly, though it felt like breaking. "I'll try." She touched his arm, a brief, trembling gesture, then disapparated with a faint crack that left the air cold and still. George stood alone by the gate for a long while, staring at the empty space where she'd been. The night was utterly silent. No wind, no laughter, only the low hum of crickets in the distance. When he finally turned back toward the house, the lights from the windows glowed warm and golden, the sound of voices faint inside. Charlie's laugh drifted through the glass, and George paused. He took a deep breath, forcing the weight in his chest down where it couldn't be seen. He would not ruin this. He would not become the shadow of another man's happiness. He climbed the stairs quietly, closing the door behind him. The moonlight fell across the room in a soft silver line, and for the first time in years, he whispered Fred's name aloud. "I'll be all right," he said. "I have to be." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the orchard through the window. The trees rustled faintly, as though the house itself was exhaling. And though George couldn't see it yet, though his heart ached with loss, the night had already begun to change, setting in motion the fragile chain of choices that would soon turn brotherhood into something tested, and love into something deeper than either of them had ever known. Winter crept upon the countryside like a patient ghost. The hills turned pale, the trees silvered with frost, and the burrow's crooked chimneys puffed steam into the cold, still air. The fields glittered in morning light, and though the house glowed warm from within, the hearts inside it carried their own storms. George had not spoken of that evening by the gate to anyone. To all appearances, he was the same as ever, helpful, wry, full of quiet humor that only half hid the ache behind his eyes. He rose early to apparate to Diagon Alley, worked late in the shop, came home tired, and smiled whenever his mother fussed. Yet something had settled in him like snow, heavy, soundless, impossible to shake. Audrey still visited often. She and Charlie were rarely apart now, though they did little to draw attention to it. There was no announcement, no talk of courtship, but their closeness was plain to anyone who looked. George did not look often. On one brittle December afternoon, he was in the gardens splitting firewood with a charm when Charlie appeared beside him. "Thought you might like some help," Charlie said, leaning against the fence. George kept his wand moving. "Plenty of logs for both of us." For a while they worked in silence, the rhythmic thud of split wood filling the air. Then Charlie spoke again. "I talked to Audrey about you," he said. George froze, his wand hovering mid-air. "About me?" "She told me you'd spoken to her," Charlie went on gently. "Said she hoped you weren't angry." George set down his wand. "Angry?" He laughed under his breath, though it sounded hollow. "No, I'm not angry." Charlie studied him for a long moment. "You could be, you know. I wouldn't blame you." "There's nothing to blame," George said, forcing calm into his voice. "People don't choose where their hearts land." Charlie smiled faintly. "No, I suppose they don't." He picked up another log and split it cleanly, the pieces tumbling into the snow. "You'll find someone, George. You've got too much good in you not to." George didn't answer. He knew Charlie meant it kindly, but the words slid through him like a knife made of ice. That evening, when everyone gathered inside, the burrow was lit by the fire's orange glow. Audrey sat by the hearth, knitting something in pale blue wool, while Molly hummed softly beside her. Charlie lounged on the sofa, telling Ginny and Harry about his latest dragon-handling mishap. The laughter came easy, light, filling the room with warmth. George sat apart, pretending to mend a toy broom for one of his nephews. The light flickered across his face, and though he smiled at the right moments, his mind was elsewhere, on the snow beyond the windows, on the stars that burned cold and distant above the world. When Audrey looked up from her knitting and met his eyes, she gave him a small smile, hesitant, almost apologetic. He returned it, a brief curve of the lips, then turned back to his work. After everyone had gone to bed, George stayed downstairs, watching the embers die. He could still hear faint laughter from above, muffled by the wooden floors. His family, his home, his brother, all the things that should have been enough. "Fred," he whispered into the empty room, "if you were here, you'd know what to say." A soft creak answered him, the sound of a floorboard shifting, and for a fleeting moment he could have sworn he heard laughter, light as wind. It was gone before he could breathe it in. The days shortened, snow deepened. The shop in Diagon Alley bustled with holiday shoppers, and George threw himself into his work with near-manic focus. He created new joke products, designed colourful displays, and charmed the front windows to snow-glittering sparks. He smiled for customers, cracked jokes with old friends, and sent home bags full of cheer. But when the doors locked at night, he would stand alone behind the counter, the glow of the lamps reflecting on glass jars and glittering powders, and feel an emptiness that no laughter could fill. One night, as he was closing up, he heard the familiar sound of someone apparating outside. When he opened the door, Audrey stood there, bundled in a grey cloak, snow dusting her hair. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly. George blinked, startled. "Audrey, what are you doing here?" She hesitated before answering. "Charlie said you've been working too much. I thought you might like company." For a moment, all he could do was stare. Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The shop was quiet now, its shelves dim under candlelight. Audrey wandered between displays, smiling faintly. "You've built something wonderful here, George." He gave a small shrug. "Fred and I did. I just keep it alive." "You've done more than that," she said, turning toward him. "You've made people laugh again. That matters." He wanted to believe her, but the words stuck in his throat. "Maybe," he murmured. She took a step closer. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said suddenly. "I never wanted to." "I know." His voice was low, steady, though his hands trembled. "You didn't. It just happened." She nodded, eyes shining in the lamplight. "Charlie's a good man, but so are you." George managed a small, weary smile. "That's the trouble with good men. We fall for the same good woman." For a moment, silence stretched between them, soft, fragile, full of things unsaid. Then she reached out, touching his arm. "You'll find peace, George. I know you will." He looked down at her hand, pale against his sleeve, and felt something break loose inside him. Not pain this time, but release. "Maybe that's enough for now," he said quietly. She squeezed his arm once more, then pulled back. "Merry Christmas, George." "Merry Christmas," he echoed. When she disapparated, the air shimmered faintly, leaving behind the faint scent of frost and wool. George stood there long after she was gone, listening to the silence. Outside, snow fell thick and soft, cloaking Diagon Alley in white. He stepped into the street, the world muffled and still. The shop behind him glowed warmly through its windows, and for the first time in many months, he didn't feel trapped by it. He looked up at the sky, where snowflakes drifted through the gaslight, and smiled faintly. Somewhere inside him, a spark, small, uncertain, but real, began to stir. At the burrow, Charlie sat by the window, watching for the sound of footsteps that didn't come. Audrey returned a little after midnight, cheeks pink from the cold. She didn't speak of where she'd been, and Charlie didn't ask. He simply pulled her close and kissed her forehead as the old house sighed softly around them. Upstairs, the family slept. Downstairs, the fire burned low. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, weaving its quiet spell over the world. And though no one in the burrow could yet see it, the frost that had lingered between two brothers was beginning, slowly, painfully, to thaw. The new year came to the burrow wrapped in white, every tree bowed beneath snow and the air bright with frost. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, carrying the scent of cinnamon and pine through the crisp morning. It was a season for firesides and laughter, for the gentle hum of family gathered close. Yet in the quiet corners of that warmth, George Weasley walked beneath his own winter. The holidays had passed with their usual Weasley chaos: enchanted baubles, enchanted pudding, and enchanted arguments. But beneath the merriment, a subtle unease had settled. Audrey's visits had become more frequent, and though she carried herself with her usual gentleness, there was something measured in her smile now, a hint of hesitation whenever her gaze brushed George's. Charlie was radiant, unaware or unwilling to see the careful distance growing between them. George thought he'd made his peace with it. He told himself so every morning when he rose early to apparate to Diagon Alley. Every night when he returned home, tired enough to sleep without dreaming. But sometimes, when he heard Charlie and Audrey laughing together in the garden, he would stop, hand resting on the doorframe, and feel the ache return, quiet but relentless, like an old injury that refused to heal. One evening, as twilight painted the snow in lavender light, George found himself walking by the river. The trees stood bare and black against the fading sky, and the water moved beneath a thin crust of ice. He had come here often as a boy with Fred, racing stones across the surface or daring each other to jump from the low bridge into the summer current. Now, the stillness felt almost sacred. He didn't notice Charlie until his brother appeared beside him, crunching through the frost with that familiar, easy stride. "Figured I'd find you out here," Charlie said, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "You always did like this spot." George managed a small smile. Old habits die hard. They stood side by side for a while, watching the slow swirl of mist over the water. The silence was comfortable at first, but soon it thickened, heavy with all the words neither of them had spoken. "George," Charlie began finally, his breath fogging in the cold. "I need to ask you something, and I'd rather you told me straight." George turned slightly. "Go on." Charlie hesitated. "It's about Audrey." Of course it was. It was always about Audrey. "What about her?" "She's distant lately," Charlie said quietly. "Not cold exactly, just thoughtful, different, and I can't help thinking it's because of you." George's jaw tightened. "Because of me?" "I don't mean it as blame," Charlie said quickly. I know you cared for her. Still do, maybe. And I need to know if she's torn because of it." George looked back toward the river, the thin ice gleaming pale blue under the fading light. "You want the truth?" "I do." "I did care for her," George said at last. More than I meant to. But that's over. Whatever you think, I'd never stand in your way. Charlie studied him. You're sure of that? George met his gaze. I'd sooner cut off my wand hand than hurt you. The tension in Charlie's shoulders eased, and for a moment he smiled, the same warm, reckless grin that had once been Fred's. I know, mate. I just needed to hear it. They walked back to the burrow together in silence. The windows glowed golden ahead of them, and from within came the sound of music and laughter. Molly had enchanted the old wireless again, and Arthur's voice rose cheerfully as he argued with Ginny about the rules of some new Muggle card game. Inside, Audrey was by the fire, her hair unbound, the flickering light catching copper glints in its dark strands. She looked up when the door opened, her smile faltering for an instant before returning. "There you are," she said softly. Charlie leaned down to kiss her cheek, shaking snow from his coat. Found him wandering near the river again. Thought the Grindylows might have gotten him. Audrey laughed, but her eyes flickered toward George. Cold out there? Not too bad, George said. Peaceful. For the rest of the evening, they all talked and played games, yet something in the air felt fragile, as though even the house itself held its breath. Audrey's laughter came a little too brightly. George's jokes landed just a heartbeat too late. Charlie, oblivious, basked in the warmth of it all, unaware of the quiet current running beneath. When the others finally went to bed, George lingered by the dying fire. Audrey stayed too, folding her knitting neatly into a small basket. "You shouldn't stay up," she said after a moment. "You've been working too hard." "Could say the same for you," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Charlie worries about you, you know. He thinks you're lonely." "Charlie worries about everyone." Audrey looked at him then, properly looked, the way she had that first day in the kitchen, with eyes that saw far more than he wished they would. "Are you lonely, George?" He hesitated. "Sometimes." The fire popped softly. Audrey's gaze drifted to the flames. "You're not the only one." The words were barely above a whisper, and they struck him like a spell. He wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to reach out and pull truth from the quiet between them. But before he could, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Charlie appeared, hair tousled, half smiling. "Still awake? I was beginning to think the fire had eaten you both." "Just talking," George said quickly. Charlie grinned. "Come on then, Aud. Mum'll have my hide if you fall asleep down here." Audrey rose, gathering her things. As she passed George, her hand brushed his, light, fleeting, but enough to set his pulse racing. Then she was gone, following Charlie upstairs. When the house finally fell silent, George sat staring into the embers until they dimmed to ash. He told himself he'd imagined her words, imagined the look in her eyes, the touch of her hand. It was easier that way, safer. But deep down, he knew better. Something had shifted again, something neither of them could ignore for much longer. Outside, snow began to fall once more, blanketing the world in silence. The moon hung low over the orchard, pale and watchful, as if it too could feel the tremor of what was to come. And in that still hour before dawn, the burrow seemed to sigh, the wind curling through its crooked walls like a whisper of warning, a promise that no secret, however carefully buried, stays hidden forever. The weeks that followed slipped by like slow-turning pages, each day heavier than the last. February brought bitter winds and long nights. the kind of cold that sank through every crack of the burrow and turned the windows to mirrors of frost. The house, always so full of laughter, seemed quieter these days, as though it too had begun to listen to the unspoken tension that lingered between its walls. George tried to busy himself with his work at the shop, but even the magic there seemed dulled. His customers still laughed, still marveled at the endless tricks and charms, yet when the last door closed at night, silence would fall again, thick and unmoving. He would sit at the counter, the flickering light of the lamps painting long shadows across the shelves, and feel that same gnawing sense of distance between who he was and who he had been. Charlie and Audrey, by contrast, appeared closer than ever. They spent their days together, helping Arthur with a ministry inspection project that had spilled across half the sitting room. Charlie's laughter often filled the house, deep and warm, and Audrey's voice followed it like a melody. And though George smiled when they were near, it felt like smiling through glass, the warmth never reaching his eyes. One evening, as twilight settled over the hills, George sat at the kitchen table alone, carving small runes into a length of driftwood. The rhythmic scrape of his knife was almost soothing. Then the back door opened, and Audrey stepped in from the cold. "Oh," she said softly, surprised. "I didn't know anyone was still up." "Can't sleep," George said without looking up. "Working on something for the shop." She removed her gloves and came to stand beside him, peering at the runes. "That's Norse, isn't it? Protective magic." He glanced up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Impressed you recognize it." "I read," she said simply, returning the smile. For a moment they were quiet. The fire crackled, throwing shifting patterns of light across the table. George's hands moved steadily over the wood, though his pulse had quickened. Audrey's presence filled the room in that quiet, steady way of hers. Not commanding, not demanding, simply there. "How's the project going?" he asked, his voice low. "Slowly," she said, sighing. "Your father's brilliant, but his fascination with plug sockets has no limits. Charlie nearly electrocuted himself yesterday." George chuckled. "Wouldn't be the first time." Her laughter followed his, warm and genuine. Then, as it faded, the quiet settled between them again. Softer this time, almost companionable. Audrey watched him work for a while, her eyes tracing the careful movements of his hands. "You're good at that," she said finally. He shrugged. "Fred used to say my runes looked like a Kniesel's paw prints." "I think they're beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He froze for just a heartbeat. Then he set down the carving knife, meeting her gaze. "Audrey." But she looked away, her hands tightening around the edge of the table. "I shouldn't have said that." "Maybe not," he said softly. "But you meant it." She turned back toward him then, eyes bright in the firelight. "Charlie's good to me, George. Better than I deserve." "He is," George said. "I care for him," she went on. "I truly do. But sometimes I wonder if that's the same as love." George's breath caught. "And what do you think love is?" She gave a small, helpless laugh. "I don't know. Maybe it's this feeling that never seems to fade, no matter how much I wish it would." Her words fell like sparks into the still air. George stood slowly, every part of him taut with something between hope and fear. "Then tell me to stop," he said quietly. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." Audrey shook her head. "You know I can't." Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and for a moment it felt as if the whole world had drawn in its breath. Then, footsteps creaked on the stairs above, heavy, unhurried, familiar. Charlie's voice drifted down, warm and sleepy. "Aud, you still up?" Audrey stepped back as though waking from a trance. "Coming!" she called quickly, her voice trembling. George turned away, pretending to busy himself with the carving, though his hand shook. "I shouldn't have come," she said quietly. "Probably not," George replied, his voice low. "But I'm not sorry you did." Her eyes softened, sad and full of something he couldn't name. Then she turned and hurried to the stairs, her footsteps light against the wood. When she was gone, George sat back down, his breath unsteady. He looked at the piece of wood before him, the runes half finished, their carved lines sharp and uncertain, and realized his hands were trembling too much to go on. He stayed there until dawn, the fire burning low, the snow outside glowing faintly in the pale morning light. By the next day, Audrey and Charlie had left for London. Percy had arranged for them to assist in a field inspection at the ministry, a project that would keep them away for several weeks. Molly fretted over their departure, sending them off with enough food to feed a regiment, while George stood by the gate, watching in silence as they disapparated. For a moment, relief washed over him. Not joy, but a numb kind of quiet. He told himself it was for the best. Distance would cool whatever impossible thing had begun between them. But days later, when an owl arrived bearing a short letter in Audrey's careful handwriting. "Hope you're well. The city's dreadful without snow. Charlie says hello." The ache returned stronger than before. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket, telling himself it meant nothing. Yet he found himself reading it again that night, by candlelight, the words smudged by his thumb. Weeks passed. Winter began to yield, though reluctantly. The orchard behind the burrow shimmered with frost-tipped buds, the promise of spring stirring beneath the frozen ground. George threw himself into his work again, but he no longer fooled anyone. Ginny watched him with quiet worry. Even Molly seemed gentler with her scolding. And then, one morning, an owl came bearing news that broke through the frozen calm. A dragon at the Romanian sanctuary had been injured. One of the largest, a temperamental iron-belly Charlie had trained himself. The handlers needed him back immediately. Charlie left that same day after a hurried breakfast and a round of hugs from his family. Audrey went with him, of course, though she hesitated at the door, her eyes meeting George's for a fleeting, wordless moment. "Take care of him," George said quietly. "I will," she whispered. When they disapparated, the echo of it seemed to linger in the air long after they were gone. The burrow felt emptier than ever in the days that followed. George wandered the orchard in the evenings, the ground softening beneath the first signs of thaw. The cold was breaking, but inside him the frost only deepened. And somewhere far away, beneath a foreign sky, Audrey Spinett stood beside a roaring dragon's fire. Her thoughts not on the beast before her, but on the memory of a man who had carved runes by firelight and told her he'd never stop unless she asked him to. The days turned restless after Charlie and Audrey's departure, and though the first buds of spring began to show on the black branches of the orchard, the burrow felt bare without its usual noise. The air inside the house was different now, too still, as if waiting for something to break it. Molly filled the silence with cooking and small fretting. Arthur buried himself in the cluttered shed, and George, as ever, escaped to Diagon Alley. The shop had begun to bloom again with business, bright with the colours of the new season. Students from Hogwarts filled the aisles, clamouring for the latest skiving snack boxes and spellfire fireworks. George smiled and joked and handed out free samples, but every smile faded the instant the door shut behind the last customer. When he looked at himself in the glass, he could see the shadow that no one else seemed to notice. A man half-made, caught between laughter and loss. Sometimes, when he was alone, he would take out Audrey's letter. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the edges had softened. He had memorized the words, but he still read them, tracing her delicate handwriting as though it could keep her voice near. He told himself it would fade. That distance and time would dull whatever fragile thread still connected them. But it didn't. It grew quieter, perhaps, deeper, but never less alive. Weeks later, when an owl arrived again, bearing another letter, the dragon's healing well. Charlie says the worst is over. We'll return soon. George felt both relief and dread settle inside him. The words carried warmth, yet underneath them was something else, something that pulsed between the lines. We'll return soon. He could almost hear her voice saying it, and the way it lingered made his heart ache all over again. When the day of their return finally came, the sky hung low and grey, smelling faintly of rain. George waited outside the burrow, his hands deep in his pockets, the grass damp beneath his boots. With a crack of displaced air, they appeared. Charlie first, tanned and grinning, his cloak scorched at the hem, and Audrey just behind him, her hair tangled by the wind. "Merlin, it's good to be home," Charlie exclaimed, throwing his arms wide as he trudged up the path. "Didn't realize how much I missed the smell of Mum's cooking." Molly burst out of the door, apron flapping. "Charlie Weasley, look at you. You've lost weight. Were you living on fire ash and wishful thinking?" "Mostly wishful thinking," Charlie said cheerfully, submitting to her embrace. Audrey smiled as she watched them, but her eyes found George almost at once. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, that strange, suspended moment between strangers and something else. Then she gave a small nod, the kind that said everything and nothing at once. "Welcome back," George said quietly. "Thank you," she replied. The burrow filled with celebration that evening. The table overflowed with Molly's cooking. Laughter echoed off every crooked wall, and the old clock on the mantel ticked contentedly, as though marking the rhythm of the family's heart. Yet beneath the warmth and chatter, George felt the undercurrent return, the pull he had tried to forget, stronger now that she was near again. Later, when the others had gone to bed, George stepped outside to breathe in the cool night air. The orchard was dark, its branches stirring in the breeze. He walked among them, his footsteps soft on the damp ground, until the glow of the house was only a faint gold behind him. He wasn't surprised when he heard her voice. "You always walk out here when you're thinking." He turned. Audrey stood a few paces away, her cloak drawn tight against the wind. The moonlight caught in her hair, turning it silver. "Old habit," George said. "It's quieter out here." "I can see why," she murmured. "The air smells like spring." They stood in silence for a moment, the night alive with the distant hum of crickets. Then George said, "How was Romania?" She smiled faintly. "Beautiful, cold, full of creatures that could set you on fire if you looked at them wrong. Charlie loved every minute of it. And you? Her eyes flickered toward him. I'm not sure. It was good to get away, to think. About what? Audrey hesitated, then said softly, about where I belong. George's chest tightened. And did you figure it out? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice trembled. I thought I had, but then I came back. The words hung between them, fragile as the mist that wove through the orchard. George took a step closer, though not enough to touch her. Audrey, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've tried to do what's right. Charlie deserves someone who can give him all her heart, but mine... She broke off, closing her eyes. Mine won't listen. George's breath came unevenly. You can't say that, he said hoarsely. You can't tell me this now. I shouldn't, she agreed, her hands trembling at her sides. But I can't pretend anymore. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The orchard, the stars, the wind, all fell silent. Then, from the distance, the burrow's door creaked open. Charlie's voice carried faintly through the night. Aud, you out here? Audrey stepped back, her eyes wide. I have to go. George's hand twitched as if to stop her, but he forced it still. Go, he said quietly. She nodded once, turned, and hurried toward the light spilling from the doorway. Charlie met her halfway, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, laughing softly as they vanished inside. George remained beneath the trees, alone. The wind picked up, scattering petals and frost alike across the grass. He stood there until the last light in the house went dark, until the night swallowed every trace of sound. The next morning, he left early for the shop, claiming he had an order to fill. He didn't return for days. When he did, Charlie was waiting. His expression was guarded, the easy warmth replaced by something harder. George, he said, his voice low. We need to talk. George froze. About what? Charlie's jaw tightened. About Audrey. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the old clock. Charlie's eyes met his, unflinching. I'm not an idiot, George. I see how she looks at you, how you look at her. Charlie! Don't, Charlie cut in sharply. Just tell me, is there something between you? George opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to lie, to make it simple, to save what little peace they had left. But he couldn't. Yes, he said finally. There was. Maybe there still is. But I never meant for it to happen. Charlie's face went pale. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice that trembled with both anger and hurt, he whispered, Fred would have known what to do. That name, their brother's name, hit like a curse. George's breath caught. Fred isn't here, he said quietly. No, Charlie said. And maybe that's the problem. You've been chasing ghosts since the war ended. With that, Charlie turned and walked out the door, leaving George alone with the echo of his words. Outside, the wind had shifted again, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of rain. The orchard bent beneath it, whispering through the dark. George sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Somewhere above him, thunder rumbled, distant yet approaching, as though the storm that had been building for months was at last beginning to break. The storm broke 2 days later. Rain swept across the fields like a living thing, hissing against the burrow's windows and making the trees bow low beneath its weight. The house creaked and shuddered, its crooked walls groaning under the wind. It was as though the weather itself had caught the fury that none of the Weasleys dared speak aloud. George had been in his room since the argument, venturing out only when he couldn't avoid it. His mother had noticed, of course, though she said nothing beyond her usual fussing. "You're too thin," she'd scold, setting a bowl of stew before him, pretending not to see how untouched it remained. Charlie, for his part, had thrown himself into helping Arthur repair the shed roof, despite the storm, his voice loud, his movements sharp. The house was too small now, too full of everything they wouldn't say. Audrey was still there, though she kept mostly to herself. She helped Molly with the household charms, read quietly by the fire, and avoided both brothers whenever she could. Yet her eyes gave her away. Whenever George entered a room, her gaze flicked toward him, full of unspoken words she no longer dared to speak. By the third night of rain, the silence was unbearable. George lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the storm clawed at the house. Sleep would not come. The air was thick with something he couldn't name. Guilt, longing, grief, all tangled together. Finally he rose, pulled on his coat, and crept downstairs. The kitchen was dark, except for the faint glow of the dying fire. The smell of rain drifted through the open window, cool and clean. George poured himself a cup of tea, though he didn't drink it. He was halfway through setting the cup down when a soft voice came from behind him. "You should be asleep." He turned. Audrey stood at the doorway, a shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, her hair slightly damp, as though she'd been standing by the window upstairs. "Could say the same for you," George replied. She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the old wooden floor. "It's hard to sleep when everything feels wrong." He gave a faint laugh, a sound without humor. "That's one way to put it." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped softly. Rain beat against the windows in steady rhythm. Then Audrey moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "Charlie hasn't said much," she murmured, "but I know you argued." George exhaled, leaning against the counter. "He deserved better than what I gave him." "He deserved the truth," she said quietly. "You both did." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "And what about you? What do you deserve?" Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer still, until he could see the faint shimmer of tears at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered. "I thought I did once, but now—" Her voice broke. George reached out instinctively, his hand brushing her arm. She didn't pull away. "I never wanted to hurt him," she said, her voice shaking. "He's kind, brave, everything anyone could want. But when I look at him, I feel safe. When I look at you—" She trailed off, her eyes burning into his. "When I look at you, I feel alive." The words hit him like lightning, sudden and terrible. For a moment, the world shrank to a space between them. The faint light of the fire, the scent of rain, the rapid drum of his own heart. "Audrey," he said, his voice rough. "If we cross this line, there's no going back. I know. Charlie's my brother. I know that too." He closed his eyes. "Then why are you still here?" "Because I can't walk away." The confession hung in the air like a spell neither dared to break. Then, before either could stop it, George stepped forward and kissed her. It was not the desperate, wild thing he'd imagined in dreams. It was soft, trembling, filled with grief as much as longing. For a heartbeat, she kissed him back, her hands clutching at his coat, as though holding on to something she already knew she would lose. Then she drew back, breathing hard, her eyes wide with something between fear and sorrow. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She took a step back, shaking her head. "I have to tell him." George felt the floor tilt beneath him. "Audrey." "He deserves to know," she said, her voice barely steady. "All of it." And before he could stop her, she turned and fled from the kitchen, the door closing softly behind her. George stood motionless. The storm roared louder outside, the wind lashing the windows, as though echoing the chaos inside him. He pressed his hands against the counter, breathing hard. He wanted to run after her, to beg her not to say anything. But he couldn't. She was right. Charlie deserved the truth. When morning came, the rain had eased, but the air still smelled of thunder. George descended the stairs slowly, his heart heavy. The kitchen was quiet, the table empty. From outside came the faint sound of voices, sharp, raised, unmistakable. He stepped out onto the porch. In the garden, Charlie stood near the orchard, his face pale with anger, his voice cutting through the damp air. Audrey stood before him, her shoulders squared though she trembled. "You told him?" George asked, his voice barely audible. Charlie turned, eyes blazing. "She didn't have to. I already knew." "Charlie, no!" Charlie's shout cracked through the air. "Don't you dare make excuses. You're my brother, George, my own blood. And you—" He turned on Audrey, his voice breaking. "You said you loved me." "I do," Audrey whispered. "Just not the way you need me to." Charlie laughed, a sound without joy. "Brilliant. Perfect." He looked back at George, his eyes full of pain. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" George swallowed. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "But it did," Charlie said bitterly. "And you can't charm this away." For a long time, none of them spoke. The rain dripped softly from the trees. Then Charlie shook his head, his voice quiet but shaking. "I'm leaving. Today." "Where will you go?" Molly's voice came from behind them. She stood in the doorway, pale and stunned. "Back to Romania," Charlie said. "It's simpler there. Dragons don't lie." And before anyone could stop him, he turned, striding across the wet grass. With a crack, he was gone. The garden fell silent. Audrey covered her face with her hands, trembling. Molly sank onto the steps, her eyes wide with shock. And George stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had just broken. The storm had passed, but its ruin remained, scattered and raw, like the branches strewn across the orchard after the wind. Somewhere above them, the sky cleared, pale sunlight spilling weakly through the clouds. But George could feel no warmth in it. He knew that, whatever came next, the cost of love had been paid, and it had taken everything. Spring came, hesitant and uneven, as though afraid to set foot upon the scarred earth. The storms had passed, but their echoes lingered, in the swollen river that cut through the meadows, in the splintered branches scattered across the orchard, and in the hearts of those left behind at the burrow. Charlie was gone. He had not written. The sound of his laughter, the steady warmth that once filled every corner of the house, had vanished with the same abruptness as his disapparition. For days, the family moved through the house like ghosts, their words quiet, their faces drawn. Molly tried to speak of him only in passing, but even her tireless optimism faltered. "He'll come round," she said often, mostly to herself. He just needs time. Audrey did not stay. She had packed her things in silence that same afternoon, her hands trembling as she folded the shawl Molly had lent her months before. When she turned to George at the foot of the stairs, she looked hollow, not angry, not defiant, simply emptied of whatever light she'd carried. "I'll go to London," she had said quietly. "Percy will find a place for me at the ministry." George had tried to answer, but no sound came, so he'd only nodded. She hesitated a moment longer, her eyes searching his face for something she couldn't find, then stepped forward and kissed his cheek, soft as breath, a farewell that burned more than any confession. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, and then she was gone. That was 3 weeks ago. Now the burrow stood under a pale sky, the scent of new grass drifting through its windows. Yet inside, the air was thick with things left unsaid. George spent most of his days in Diagon Alley, working longer hours than ever, sleeping at the shop when he could. He told his mother it was because business was good, but she wasn't fooled. "You can't live at that shop forever, George," she said one evening, setting a plate of stew before him. "You're not one of your toys. You need rest." "I'm fine," he murmured, pushing food around with his fork. "You're not," she said gently. "You're just pretending better than the rest of us." He looked up, startled, and for a heartbeat, the tired smile he'd been wearing slipped. Molly reached across the table, taking his hand. "You've carried enough sorrow, my boy. Don't make it your whole life." That night, he dreamt of Fred, vivid, laughing, alive. They were in the shop again, surrounded by boxes that floated and sang and exploded into colors. Fred turned to him, eyes bright. "You can't fix everything, Georgie," he said, "but you can still live." Then he vanished, and George woke with the echo of his laughter ringing in his ears. The next morning, George made a decision. He packed a small bag, left a note for Molly, and apparated to London. He didn't tell anyone, but he knew where he was going. The ministry was a blur of stone corridors and murmured spells, the air humming with official magic. He found Percy first, brisk, composed, all starch and authority, and asked where she was. Percy hesitated, frowning. "Audrey's in the Department of Magical Transportation. She's been busy lately." George thanked him and left before Percy could ask questions. He found her in a narrow office stacked with parchment and old maps of the flu network. She looked different, thinner perhaps, her hair tied neatly back, her face pale from too many sleepless nights. When she saw him, she froze. "George," he tried to smile. "You're still here. I wasn't sure you'd stay in London." "I thought about leaving," she said softly, "but running doesn't make things right." He nodded, stepping closer. "I didn't come to make things right. I just needed to see you." Audrey exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering. "Charlie hasn't written to me either." "I know." For a long moment they stood there, two people tethered by everything that had gone wrong. The ministry's faint hum of magic filled the silence. "I keep thinking," she said at last, "that if I'd made a different choice, if I'd stayed quiet or left sooner, maybe none of this would have happened." George shook his head. "It would have happened anyway. We were already too far gone." Her eyes shimmered, though no tears fell. "I can't undo what we did." "Neither can I," he said, "but I can live with it, somehow." She looked up sharply, surprised. "I've been angry," George admitted. At myself, at Fred even, for leaving me to sort through a life he was supposed to be part of. But I think I finally understand something. Love doesn't disappear, it just changes. It becomes something else when it can't be what it was. Audrey stared at him for a long time, then whispered, "What has ours become?" He smiled faintly. "A lesson, maybe. One I won't forget." They said little more after that. When he left, she followed him to the atrium. They stood beneath the golden fountain, the reflections of light dancing over their faces. "Goodbye, George," she said. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "Goodbye, Audrey." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Outside, London shimmered with spring rain. The streets were crowded, alive with movement. George tilted his face upward, letting the drizzle wash against his skin. For the first time in months, he felt the faint stirrings of something like peace. Days passed, and letters began arriving from Romania, brief, clipped, but real. Charlie wrote to their parents first, then to George. "I need time," the letter said simply, "but I'm not gone for good." George read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel. The ache in his chest softened a little. Summer came to the burrow at last. The air grew heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of bees. Laughter returned in fragments. Ginny visiting with Harry and their little girl, Ron chasing after a mischievous toddler, Molly humming again as she cooked. George still carried his sorrow, but it no longer crushed him. He worked in the orchard, helping Arthur repair the old broom shed, and sometimes when the evening light stretched long and golden over the fields, he caught himself smiling without meaning to. On one such evening, as he stood by the gate watching the sunset, an owl swooped down, dropping a letter into his hands. The handwriting was neat, unmistakable. "I hope you're well," it read. "Charlie has written to me, too. He sounds happier. I wanted you to know that I'm leaving the ministry, taking a post in France. I think it's time I started again. Take care of yourself, George. A." He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket. The wind rustled through the apple blossoms, scattering a few pale petals across his hair. George looked toward the horizon, the fields stretching endless and bright. For the first time, the future did not feel like something to fear. It was vast, uncertain, but alive. He turned back toward the burrow, its crooked outline glowing in the dusk, the windows bright with candlelight. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the air, real, unguarded, healing. And though his heart still bore its scars, George Weasley walked home with a steadier step, ready at last to live not for ghosts or regrets, but for the light that had somehow, against all odds, returned. Autumn arrived quietly that year, as if the season itself knew the Weasleys needed gentleness. The orchard turned gold and red, the trees heavy with fruit, and the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and apples. At the burrow, time began to settle into a new rhythm, slower, softer, touched by peace rather than grief. Charlie's letters grew longer. They arrived on crisp parchment smelling faintly of ash and dragonfire. He wrote of wide skies, of wind that carried the cry of dragons across the mountains, of days spent rebuilding the sanctuary pens. In each letter, there was a trace of something different, a calm he had never possessed before. "Tell Mum I'm fine," one note said, "and tell George." I miss the noise of home. George read those words again and again. They weren't forgiveness, not yet, but they were something close. The rift that had torn the brothers apart no longer felt bottomless. It was mending, quietly, like a bone knitting under the skin. Life at the Burrow carried on. Ginny and Harry brought their children often, filling the house with the sound of tiny feet and uncontrollable laughter. Ron and Hermione stopped by with stories from the ministry, their voices rising and falling in cheerful bickering. Molly bustled about with her endless cooking, while Arthur's workshop hummed with new inventions that smoked or sparked at unpredictable intervals. George had become the quiet center of it all, still mischievous in moments, but tempered now, steadier. He'd reopened the second floor of the shop, expanding it into a space for young inventors, Hogwarts students who wanted to test their charms under his guidance. It brought back something he'd lost: purpose. And though Fred's absence would forever echo in every laugh and explosion of colour, George had learned to let that echo fill him with warmth instead of pain. One afternoon in late September, as he sorted through a crate of fainting fancies, an owl swooped through the shop's open window. The parchment it carried bore the seal of the French ministry. George hesitated before untying it, his heart giving a strange, half-forgotten jolt. The letter was brief. George, I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to know that I've settled in Paris. The work is good, demanding, but meaningful. The city feels alive in ways I hadn't expected. Sometimes when I pass the Seine at night, I think of the river behind the Burrow and the sound of the trees in the wind. I hope you and your family are well. Tell Molly I still use her jam recipe. Audrey. He read it twice, then a third time. The ache that followed wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, bittersweet, like the fading trace of perfume in the air. He folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer beneath the counter, where it joined Charlie's latest note and a handful of others he hadn't yet thrown away. That night, George returned home later than usual. The sky was deep blue, streaked with the first chill of autumn stars. He paused at the edge of the orchard, listening to the wind murmur through the branches. In the soft rustle of leaves, he could almost hear familiar laughter, echoes of Fred's jokes, of Charlie's teasing, of Audrey's voice reading by the fire. The memories no longer hurt. They lived beside him now, like old companions. Inside, the Burrow was alive with warmth. Molly hummed by the hearth, knitting scarves for grandchildren not yet born. Arthur tinkered with a radio that sputtered but refused to play. Ginny sat at the table writing to Harry, who was away on assignment, while George poured himself a cup of tea and leaned against the doorway, content to simply listen. It struck him then how much had changed. Once he'd felt trapped in the shadow of loss, of Fred's death, of love lost, of things broken beyond repair. Now there was something gentler in that shadow. It no longer smothered, it sheltered. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the fire had burned low, George took out a small wooden box from beneath the stairs. Inside were keepsakes, a laughing photograph of him and Fred covered in soot, the charred edge of one of their first joke boxes, and the rune-carved piece of wood he had made months before, still rough but steady in his hands. He traced the carvings with his thumb. The lines, though uneven, felt alive with something that had survived the storm. The next morning dawned bright with mist curling across the fields. George rose early and walked into the orchard. The air was crisp, the grass damp beneath his boots. He carried a ladder, a basket, and his wand. It was harvest time. He worked alone for hours, humming softly under his breath. When he reached the farthest tree, the one Fred had once enchanted to sing out off-key carols in December, he paused. Its branches were heavy with apples, red and gold in the sunlight. He plucked one, polished it absently against his sleeve, and took a bite. The taste was sweet and sharp and filled his chest with a quiet, wordless joy. Later that week, another owl arrived. This one bore a Romanian postmark. George, the dragons are well. The iron belly recovered. I've been thinking about coming home for Christmas. There's talk of a younger team taking over the main pen, and I might finally have earned a proper break. What do you say? Can you stand me for a week or two? George laughed aloud as he read it. His reply was quick and certain. Come home. It's time. When Christmas came, the burrow was once again full to bursting. Snow dusted the roof, and light spilled from every window. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mingling with laughter that rose and fell like song. Charlie arrived first, stamping snow from his boots, his grin wide and uncertain all at once. Hope there's still a bed left for me, he joked. There's always room, George said, clasping his shoulder. The moment held for a breath, the weight of everything between them hanging fragile. And then it was gone. They embraced, hard and wordless, the kind of embrace that forgives without asking. The night turned golden with laughter. The Weasleys crowded around the table, their voices overlapping, their jokes terrible, and their love endless. George found himself laughing until his sides ached, tears prickling his eyes from sheer joy. He caught Molly watching him once, her smile soft and knowing, and for the first time since he could remember, he felt completely at peace. Later, when the others had gone to bed and only the fire remained, George and Charlie sat together, 2 mugs of butterbeer between them. Outside, the snow fell thick and quiet, blanketing the orchard in white. She wrote to me, George said suddenly. Charlie looked up. Audrey? George nodded. She's in Paris. Happy, I think. Charlie smiled faintly. Good. She deserves that. So do you, George said. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire dance. Then Charlie said, I don't blame you anymore, you know. I know, George replied, but I'll keep earning it anyway. Charlie chuckled. You always were the stubborn one. Fred used to say that about you. Then we both must have been right. The fire popped softly, and they both laughed. Real, easy laughter that filled the room like the echo of something long lost and finally found again. Outside, the wind whispered across the snow, carrying the faint sound of bells from the village. The burrow stood warm against the winter night, its crooked walls glowing like a lantern in the dark. And within it, 2 brothers sat side by side, broken once, mended now, their hearts lightened by time, forgiveness, and the kind of love that endures not in perfection, but in survival. Winter's breath lingered long over the hills, coating the burrow's fields with frost that glittered like powdered silver. Smoke curled gently from the crooked chimney, drifting lazily against a sky the color of pale glass. The orchard slept beneath its blanket of snow, every branch bowed and silent. But inside the Weasley home, Warmth pulsed in every corner. Laughter, light, and the steady rhythm of life continuing on. George stood by the window one morning, the pale sunlight spilling over his shoulder. He held a mug of tea that had long gone cold, watching the world beyond the glass as the mist began to rise off the frozen ground. Behind him, the kitchen was alive with familiar chaos. Molly scolding Arthur for keeping spare bolts in the teapot, Ginny and Harry trying to corral their children, and Ron loudly insisting that his mother's new jumper spell was cursed because his sleeves kept growing longer. It was the sort of morning that had once made George ache. The noise, the closeness, the constant reminder of everything that had changed. But today, he felt something different. The ache was still there, a quiet echo in his chest, but it had softened into something like gratitude. He was still here. His family was still here. That, he thought, was miracle enough. Charlie had stayed through the new year. The brothers spent long afternoons fixing up the old broom shed and mending fence charms around the orchard, speaking little but sharing the kind of silence that mended more than words could. Charlie had changed since Romania. The wildness still burned in him, but it was tempered now, focused. His letters from the sanctuary came less often, but they were filled with wonder rather than escape. On the first day of February, another owl arrived from abroad. It carried 2 letters, one addressed to Molly, the other, smaller, to George. His mother's was full of cheerful news about an upcoming visit, but George's was written in Audrey's careful hand. George, I wanted to thank you for your letter. Paris is kind to me. I've found a little flat near Montmartre, full of noise and charm. The world feels wider now, as though I've been holding my breath and can finally exhale. I thought of the orchard yesterday, the way the wind moved through the branches, and it made me smile. I hope you're well. I truly do. A. George read the letter several times before tucking it away with the others. Her words brought no sting, only a quiet warmth. The sharpness of what they'd shared had dulled into memory, but it had left behind something gentler. Respect, perhaps, or the simple knowledge that 2 lives had touched and gone on. That evening, as twilight fell, George walked through the orchard with Charlie. The snow had melted in patches, leaving the ground soft beneath their boots. The sun sank low, casting a wash of gold through the branches. "Do you ever think," Charlie said suddenly, "how strange it is that we end up right where we need to be, even when we're certain we won't?" George smiled faintly. "You've gone philosophical on me." "Dragons'll do that to you." Charlie grinned, brushing frost from his sleeve. "I spent months wondering if I'd ever come back. But the thing is, I'm glad I left. I think we both needed distance to remember what home felt like." George nodded. "And now?" Charlie looked toward the horizon, where the last light shimmered like embers. "Now, I think I might stay for a while. There's a calm here I don't find anywhere else." They reached the end of the orchard, where the river curved quietly through the fields. The same river that had witnessed so much: laughter, heartbreak, forgiveness. George knelt by the bank, picking up a smooth stone. "Do you remember when Fred and I dared you to swim here in January?" Charlie laughed, loud and unguarded. "How could I forget? I nearly froze solid. Mum nearly hexed you both into next week." George grinned, tossing the stone into the current. It broke the surface with a soft plop, sending ripples spreading outward. "He'd have liked to see us like this," he said quietly. Charlie's voice softened. "He would have, and he'd have said we were idiots for taking so long to get here." "Yeah," George murmured. "Probably." They stood there a while longer, the water whispering past, the world wrapped in dusk. Then Charlie clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, Mum'll think we've drowned again." Back inside, the burrow glowed with the kind of warmth that came not from fire, but from hearts learning after long winters to be whole again. The table was crowded with family and noise. Arthur poured cider that frothed and sparkled, and Molly beamed at her sons as if to will them never to leave again. As the night deepened, George found himself watching them all. Ginny laughing, Ron arguing, his parents glowing with pride. Even Percy, who arrived late from work, seemed to soften in the light. It struck George how fragile and precious this peace was. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. When the dishes were cleared and the candles burned low, George slipped outside once more. The night was clear, the stars sharp and endless above him. He breathed in the cold air and smiled to himself. From his pocket he pulled a small object, the piece of wood he'd carved so long ago, its runes smooth under his fingers. He set it gently at the base of the apple tree nearest the house, pressing it into the earth. "For Fred," he murmured, "and for everything that came after." A soft wind stirred, rustling through the branches, and for a fleeting moment George thought he heard laughter, faint, mischievous, unmistakable. He smiled wider, not questioning it. Some things didn't need proof. When he returned inside, the house had grown quiet. Charlie was asleep on the couch, Ginny and Ron gone to bed. Only the fire remained, its embers glowing softly. George sank into the armchair across from it, his body tired, his heart full. He thought of Audrey in her Paris flat, of Charlie in Romania, of Fred somewhere beyond both, and realized that every path they'd taken, no matter how tangled, had led them all back to this, to love, to forgiveness, to the stubborn, enduring warmth of home. The last log in the fireplace cracked, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. George closed his eyes and listened, to the hum of the old house, to the whisper of wind against the walls, to the quiet, steady beat of his own heart. And as dawn crept toward the horizon, painting the orchard in silver and gold, George Weasley smiled, not the smile of the joker he had once been, nor the broken man he'd become, but the quiet, contented smile of someone who had survived every storm and finally found peace in the light of morning. The burrow stood strong, crooked and beloved, its walls holding the laughter of generations. The river murmured softly beyond the fields, and high above, the sky began to brighten. A new day rising over a family that had lost and loved and learned to live again.